When I opened the letter he left, I finally knew who deserved his trust. That was the first sentence, written in his slow, square handwriting, the same one I'd seen on grocery lists and postcards from trips he took without me. It wasn't grief that hit me first. It was confusion, a kind that burns cold. He had been gone for 6 days. The funeral flowers were already browning in their vases. The casserole dishes returned, the neighbors back to their routines. I sat at the small oak table in the kitchen, the one he built for our first apartment, and looked at the envelope again. It had my name on it, nothing else. No, my dear, no beloved wife. Just my name, as if it were a label on something he was sending away. I had buried him with trembling hands, but that morning, holding his letter, I realized I hadn't buried everything. Some things don't stay in the ground just because we decide they should. I'm 81 years old, and I've outlived most of the people who could tell my story properly. Maybe that's why I'm the one who has to. I live now in a small, assisted living apartment overlooking the river, a quiet place where time slows to a whisper. My neighbors talk about medication schedules and grandchildren. I talk to the kettle. It answers with steam. It's a good arrangement. But that morning, the morning of the letter, even the kettle stayed silent, as if the air itself had been warned not to interrupt. I remember every texture of that day, the rough edge of the envelope, the faint scent of his cologne lingering on the paper, the dim light filtering through curtains I hadn't washed since the week before he died. I had believed we were a simple story, a long marriage, worn but steady, like an old coat that still fits even when the lining has thinned. I had believed loyalty was the same as love, that showing up every day was enough. I was wrong. His letter was not a love note or an apology. It was an account, a quiet record of a man I had lived beside for 58 years, but had not truly known for at least 20 of them. It began, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone the way most of us do. Too late to explain myself, too early to be forgiven." I read that line 3 times, as if the meaning might change with repetition. It didn't. He thanked me for the life we built, for the years we managed to stay afloat in our own weather. Then, almost casually, he mentioned her. "You'll find I've left the Buick, a small account, and the journals to Darlene. She deserves them. She kept me company in the hours you couldn't. I thought I'd misread it. The light was poor. My glasses were smudged. I took them off, wiped them with the corner of my sleeve, and read again. Darlene." The name meant nothing. He hadn't mentioned a Darlene in all our decades together. I checked the date, 6 months before his heart gave out. 6 months. And in all that time, he'd eaten my soup, watched his evening shows beside me, kissed my cheek before bed, and never once said the word that now burned through the paper. Darlene. The room began to change shape around me. It wasn't dramatic. The walls didn't spin. The air didn't thicken. It was quieter than that, more surgical. It felt like someone was erasing color from the world. The tiles under my feet seemed too white, the ticking clock too loud. I sat very still, letter trembling slightly between my fingers, as though it could explode if I moved too fast. He had left her something tangible, something chosen. The Buick, our last car, the one we used for Sunday drives to the coast. The bank account, modest but separate, unknown to me. And the journals, those private notebooks he wrote in every evening at the kitchen counter, the ones I never touched because he said they were just grocery tallies and thoughts to forget. I had believed that too. My life, it seems, has been built on small beliefs that kept the peace while the truth grew roots beneath them. I didn't cry. Not then. Grief, I've learned, is a slow eater. It starts with the soft tissue, the little assumptions, the habits, the shared jokes, and works its way to the bone. I remember thinking how strange it was that betrayal could arrive so neatly folded, mailed from beyond the grave. I stood, poured myself a cup of cold coffee from the pot I'd forgotten to empty, and drank it like medicine. The taste was bitter enough to make sense of the day. The television was on mute, frozen on some smiling news anchor, and I thought, how polite life is about shattering people. No one announces it. The world just keeps humming. I walked through the house, letter in hand, seeing it all differently now. His chair by the window where he read the paper each morning, empty, but somehow still occupied. The bookshelf he built from reclaimed wood, the dust gathering on the spines, the framed photo from our 50th anniversary, me in a lavender dress, him with that careful, practiced smile. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred. I wanted to find a clue, a crack, a sign I'd missed, but what I saw was something worse. The ease of two people who had grown accustomed to silence. The afternoon light shifted, catching on the edge of a brass lamp, and for a moment it was as though the whole room exhaled. That's when I realized this wasn't just about another woman. It was about the spaces I'd left unguarded, the quiet corners where he must have gone to feel seen. I wanted to be angry, but anger requires energy, and mine was buried somewhere between the laundry basket and the locked drawer where he kept his notebooks. I sat down on the floor, the letter still open beside me, and whispered his name once, just to hear how it sounded when there was no one left to answer. I think people imagine betrayal as loud, a slammed door, a shouted confession, a scene, but in truth, it's soft. It comes wrapped in paper, sealed with your name, waiting patiently on the table until you're brave enough or foolish enough to open it. I wish I could say I tore it apart, cursed his memory, did something theatrical. I didn't. I smoothed the page, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the vase of dead tulips on the counter. Then I went to the window and watched the river. It moved the same as always, unbothered by the small tragedies along its banks. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the radiator hiss and the faint footsteps of the night nurse in the corridor outside my door. The letter was on the nightstand. I could feel it watching me, even in the dark. I kept thinking about the word deserved. He had written it so deliberately, as if it carried the weight of his last judgment. Who deserves trust? I had washed his shirts, paid his bills, sat beside his hospital bed, counting the seconds between his breaths. Yet, somehow, in his final accounting, I had not deserved it. That word was the true wound, sharper than any confession of love could have been. Deserved. Around 4 a.m, I rose, turned on the lamp, and read it again. The lines seemed to rearrange themselves with each reading, as though meaning were a liquid thing, shifting to fit whatever shape my mind could bear. Near the end, he'd written, "I know this will hurt you, but pain is sometimes the only honest language left." That sentence broke something loose inside me. Not my heart, that had already been weathered beyond breaking, but something older, a layer of self I hadn't touched in years. It was the part of me that had once believed in fairness, in mutual devotion, in the idea that love was a straight road you could walk to the end if you just stayed loyal enough. I finally saw that our road had been curving for decades, and neither of us had noticed because we'd stopped looking at the map. As dawn bled into the room, I poured fresh coffee and opened the window. The air was cold and smelled faintly of rain. The city was waking, buses humming, birds restless in the branches. I thought of him walking somewhere years ago, perhaps to that same pharmacy where Darlene worked, carrying a small note in his pocket, a secret folded like an apology. I thought of her waiting behind the counter, unaware that she would become the recipient of the last tenderness he had to give. And then for the first time, I felt something close to pity, not for him, not for her, but for the woman I had been, who mistook endurance for intimacy and silence for peace. When the sun finally climbed above the river, I folded the letter once more, slid it into the drawer with my own unfinished correspondence, and whispered, "All right then." Not forgiveness, not surrender, just acknowledgement. The day had already begun, and I knew, with the weary clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, that opening that letter was not the end of mourning. It was the beginning of truth. The next morning began with the sound of rain brushing against the kitchen window, soft at first, then steady, like a long, deliberate tapping that refused to let the world forget it existed. I made coffee without really tasting it, burned the toast, and still ate it, because movement was the only thing that felt alive. The letter sat on the counter where I'd left it, half under the morning newspaper, half in the shadow of the fruit bowl, as if it were trying to hide and confess at the same time. I stared at the envelope until I couldn't bear it anymore, and opened the drawer where he used to keep the bills and receipts. I knew what I was looking for even before I found it. The small, worn key to his desk in the den, the one he hadn't used openly in years. He used to call it his quiet space, which I had always assumed meant his version of solitude, a room where he could think or pretend to. Now I wondered what he had really been thinking all that time. The den smelled like dust and old varnish, and the air had the stillness of places that hold too many unsaid things. On the desk, neatly stacked, were his notebooks, the ones he used to write in every night before bed, the ones he told me were nothing more than grocery lists and stray thoughts. There were 12 of them, lined up like obedient soldiers, leather covers cracked and edges worn from use. I hesitated before touching them, not out of respect, but out of fear of confirming what I already suspected. I took the first one and opened it. The writing was dense, small, his tidy script filling every inch of the page. The first line was dated almost 4 years ago. It's strange to talk to a page when there's a living person asleep in the next room. I felt the air leave my chest. I read the next few pages slowly, as if each word were a drop of something corrosive I had to let sink in before taking the next. He wrote about routine, about silence, about the weight of the house that had grown too neat, too quiet, too full of ghosts that weren't dead yet. He never mentioned Darlene by name at first, only her, as though the presence of another human being had to be hidden even from the paper. She asks about my blood pressure and tells me to drink more water. We talk about ordinary things. She listens like the world depends on it. Later, a few entries on, he wrote, "I think she knows more about my life than my wife does, but that's my fault, not hers." I set the notebook down and pressed my palms flat on the desk, the wood cool and unyielding beneath my hands. I wanted to close the book and walk away, but curiosity and pain are siblings. They share the same stubborn appetite. I picked up another, the one dated 2 years ago, and opened it near the middle. Darlene says it's not wrong to need to be seen. She says loneliness doesn't mean disloyalty. I read that sentence over and over, and with each repetition, it felt less like his confession and more like an accusation aimed squarely at me. When had I stopped seeing him? Maybe it was after our daughter left, slamming the door on a decade of bitterness. Maybe it was after his first heart scare, when every conversation became about medication, sodium intake, and sleep schedules. Maybe I had looked at him for years without ever really seeing the man beneath the routines. The rain outside thickened into a steady downpour. I could hear it pounding on the roof, and for a moment, I imagined it washing away everything, the house, the years, even me. I closed the notebook, placed it carefully back in its row and sat down in his old chair. It creaked under my weight, the sound startling in the silence. The letter, the notebooks, the quiet, they all conspired to make one truth impossible to deny. I had been living beside a stranger who had quietly built another world where he could breathe. At noon, the phone rang. It was Anne, our daughter. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, except for one strained conversation about the memorial expenses. Her voice was sharp, impatient, the way it always got when she was about to scold me for something she didn't understand. "Mom, I got a call from the lawyer," she said. "He mentioned some irregularities in Dad's will. Something about a transfer to someone named Darlene. Who is that?" I almost laughed at the bluntness of it, at how quickly pain becomes transaction when passed from one generation to the next. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true and not true. "Don't play coy, Mom." Was he having an affair? I could hear dishes clinking in the background of her end, the life of a woman too busy to sit with grief. "I don't think so," I said quietly. "Then what was it? Why would he leave money to a stranger?" I didn't answer right away. There are questions that sound like curiosity, but are really just ways to measure blame. "Maybe she was a friend," I said finally. Anne sighed, that long exhale of someone who believes herself practical. "A friend doesn't get money in a will." "Maybe she earned it," I said before I could stop myself. The line went quiet. "Earned it? Mom, he was your husband." "He was," I said, "and he was still his own person." She hung up not long after that, muttering something about calling the lawyer again. I sat staring at the silent phone, realizing how quickly loss mutates into ownership. Everyone wants to claim the dead, to hold them, to rewrite them into something that fits their version of love. That afternoon, I decided to see Darlene for myself. The letter had mentioned the pharmacy, and I remembered him bringing home cough drops with that particular green logo I had seen in his coat pocket more than once. I took the bus downtown, an old habit from before we owned a car, and the city looked different than I remembered. Smaller, somehow, like it had stopped growing when I stopped noticing it. The pharmacy was on a corner near a laundromat and a bakery. It smelled faintly of soap and lavender. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 70s, short gray hair, glasses slipping down her nose, wearing a white smock embroidered with a name tag. Darlene. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching her count pills into small orange bottles, her movements careful, unhurried, precise. She spoke to each customer with a calm kindness that didn't sound practiced. There was something familiar in her face, not in the features themselves, but in the expression. That quiet patience I used to see in myself before life dulled the edges. When she finally looked up and met my eyes, she smiled, polite and genuine, the way a person does when they expect nothing in return. "Can I help you find something, ma'am?" she asked. Her voice was warm, low, threaded with weariness. I froze, words collapsing in my throat. I managed to murmur something about a sleep aid, and she nodded, walked me to the aisle, and handed me a small box. "This one's gentle," she said. "Doesn't leave you foggy." I thanked her and left without buying it, the box still in my hand like evidence. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet pavement and bread from the bakery next door. I walked home slowly, the city stretching out around me like a memory I didn't trust anymore. Darlene had not been what I expected. I thought she'd look guilty or smug or radiant with stolen love. She didn't. She looked like someone who simply existed where she was needed. That was the real betrayal, I realized. Not that he'd loved her, but that she had offered him something I'd forgotten how to give, uncomplicated attention, When I got home, I sat on the edge of the bed and placed the unopened box of sleep aids on the nightstand beside his photo. I thought of the notebooks, the careful way he had written, the quiet he must have carried. For years, I had blamed him for our distance. Now I saw how mutual it had been. As the evening light dimmed, I opened the window and listened to the river moving in the dark. Somewhere in that sound was the echo of his voice, or maybe just my memory shaping what it needed to hear. He hadn't left me for another woman. He had left me long before he died, in slow, invisible increments that neither of us had noticed. The letter hadn't created the distance. It had only named it. And now, sitting there with the smell of rain still in the air and the small box of pills like a gift I didn't ask for, I understood that this was the true beginning of loss. Not the funeral, not the grave, but this moment, the moment when the story of us shifted from something shared to something dissected. The catalyst wasn't his death. It was the discovery that even love, if left unattended, can vanish so quietly you mistake its absence for peace. The next weeks passed in a kind of suspended quiet, as if the air in the apartment had thickened and learned to listen. I woke every morning before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because silence has a way of dragging you out of sleep when there is too much to remember. I made coffee. I read the newspaper without seeing the words. I watched the light move slowly across the table and fade again by evening. The letter stayed where it had been, tucked into the drawer under the radio, but the knowledge it carried never rested. It followed me into each room, changed the smell of the air, the texture of everything I touched. I began to notice details that had always been there but meant nothing before. The faint indentation on the pillow where his head had lain, the small chip on the rim of his favorite mug, the clock in the hallway that ticked just slightly off-beat. Each small imperfection seemed to murmur the same thing. He had been here, and now he wasn't, and I was the one who didn't notice him leaving until it was too late. One afternoon, I decided to go through his things, not out of sentimentality. I simply couldn't bear the half-life of objects waiting for someone who would never come back. The closet smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. His suits hung neatly in a row, pressed, their sleeves folded in on themselves like men standing at attention. I ran my hand along the fabric, remembering how I used to iron them before his business trips, how he would stand behind me and rest his chin on my shoulder, how that stopped long before I realized it had. I found the shoes he wore to our daughter's wedding, still polished, soles barely worn. There was something obscene in their perfection, as if the things he owned had aged better than we had. At the back of the shelf was a box I didn't recognize, small, wrapped in an old scarf. Inside were letters, my handwriting, my name. But when I opened one, it wasn't a letter from me. It was one of his drafts, written to Darlene. The postmark on the envelope was never stamped. He must have kept them hidden. The first one began simply, "I don't know why writing to you feels like breathing again." The words were neat, deliberate, not the rambling of infatuation, but the tone of a man confessing something he believed to be almost holy. He wrote about the long evenings when the house was too quiet, about how he had tried to talk to me, but the conversations always folded in on themselves, like paper cranes too fragile to open. "You don't fix loneliness by shouting across it," he wrote. "You wait for someone who speaks softly enough for the echo to return." I set the letter down and stared at the wall until the pattern in the wallpaper began to blur. The next page was dated just a few months before his death. "I think she suspects something," he wrote, meaning me. "But not what she should. She suspects me of drifting. She doesn't realize I already have, only not in the direction she imagines. I read all of them in one sitting, the room dimming around me as the day slid into evening. When I finished, I didn't feel jealousy, not even rage, but a hollow fatigue that pressed against the ribs like a second heartbeat. I had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of composure, and here it was tested in the quietest of ways. I folded the letters back into the box, wrapped the scarf around them again, and placed them on the table beside the radio. The hum of the machine filled the silence like a weak imitation of life. I remember thinking that if he had truly loved her, if there had been anything physical, anything truly romantic, I would have felt less wounded. It wasn't passion that betrayed me, it was trust. He had given her his unfiltered thoughts, the ones he had stopped sharing with me long ago. That was the worst part, not what he had done, but what he had withheld. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the nurse knocking at my door, her cheerful voice cutting through the fog. She brought my medication, made small talk about the weather, and left before I could even find a word to respond. When the door closed, the quiet returned heavier than before. I sat at the table and wrote a list of things I could do to occupy my mind. I cleaned the pantry, sorted old photographs, threw away expired spices. Each action felt like pretending, a ritual of order in a house that had already slipped out of meaning. In the afternoon, I walked to the park by the river, carrying a small bag of breadcrumbs for the ducks the way I used to when Anne was small. The benches were damp from last night's rain. I sat anyway, ignoring the chill. Across the water, I could see the pharmacy sign glowing faintly in the gray light. I told myself I wasn't looking for her, but my eyes kept drifting in that direction, searching for a figure in a white coat. I didn't see anyone, only the reflection of the bridge, trembling in the current. When I returned home, there was a letter waiting in the mailbox. For a heartbeat, I thought it might be from her, though I had never given Darlene my name. It was from the lawyer instead, a thin envelope, official letterhead. He was informing me of the formal transfer of the Buick and the secondary account, both executed exactly as George had instructed. It was final. Darlene would receive the car within the week. I placed the letter on the counter, sat down, and stared at the framed photograph of George that stood beside the window. It wasn't the picture from our anniversary. It was from much earlier, taken on a camping trip in the early 70s. He was smiling into the sunlight, face open, hair wild from the wind. I wondered if that man had been buried, or if only his body had been. The version of him I'd lived with the last decade was quieter, careful, distant. Maybe she had met the man from the photo again, the one I'd lost somewhere between our last argument and our first compromise. That night, I dreamed of a table set for two in an empty restaurant. The tablecloth was white, the plates gleaming, but no food was ever served. I sat alone while somewhere beyond the door, music played faintly, a waltz we once danced to at someone else's wedding. When I woke, the pillow was damp, though I hadn't cried. My body had wept for me. I rose, turned on the light, and looked at the clock, 3:17 a.m. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and found the box of his letters again. I took one out at random and read the final paragraph aloud, my voice rough and thin. "I don't want to hurt her," he had written. "I just want to feel alive before I leave." The honesty of it cut deeper than any accusation could have. He hadn't intended to betray. He had simply reached for air. Maybe that was the cruelest truth, that love can suffocate even when it means no harm. Days blurred into one another. I started walking more, further each time, as though distance might soften the edges of the story. I found myself wandering into parts of town I hadn't visited in years: the library, the old post office, the cafe where George and I used to sit on Saturdays. It was still there, smaller now, with fewer tables. I ordered tea and took the same corner seat, the one by the window. The waitress, a young woman with a tired smile, asked if I wanted sugar. I shook my head. She didn't know that I used to order for both of us, that George always took his with cream, that the sound of the spoon against porcelain was once the rhythm of our weekends. When I left, I walked past the pharmacy again. The lights were off. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Closed for maintenance. Back Monday." The emptiness behind the glass looked almost peaceful, like the aftermath of a storm. That evening, as I folded laundry, I noticed one of his shirts still hanging by the window, forgotten. I pressed it against my face, expecting to find comfort in the familiar scent, but there was almost nothing left. Smells fade faster than memories, but sometimes they hurt more. I hung the shirt back up carefully, as though he might need it again. The air in the room felt heavier, the kind of heaviness that comes when truth settles into its final shape. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for anger or even closure. I was waiting for understanding, the small, merciful kind that arrives quietly when there's no one left to argue with. It took me almost a month to gather the courage to touch the notebooks again. When I finally did, I opened the last one, the pages near the end where his handwriting had started to shake. "If she ever reads this," and he wrote, "tell her I wasn't looking for a replacement. I was looking for forgiveness." I read that line until the ink blurred under my thumb. Forgiveness for what? For needing kindness? For wanting to be seen? Or for giving up on me without saying goodbye? I would never know. I closed the notebook and placed it in the box with the others. The act felt ceremonial, like lowering something sacred into the ground. I sat there for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, and thought of how strange it was that after a lifetime together, the first time I truly heard his voice was after he was gone. That night, I wrote a letter, not to Darlene, not to Anne, but to him. I didn't plan to send it anywhere. I just needed to answer. I wrote about the silence, about the years we lost pretending it was peace, about the woman I saw behind the counter who smiled without knowing who I was. I told him I understood now that loneliness can be shared by two people sitting inches apart, that love isn't an anchor, but a tide, and that sometimes it pulls you back while letting you drift. When I finished, I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it beside his last letter. The two of them sat together on the table, like an argument finally ending in exhaustion. Outside, the rain had started again, gentle, almost tender. I turned off the lights and listened to it until sleep came, heavy and dreamless, like a truce. It was a gray morning when I finally decided to leave the apartment. The air had a wet chill to it, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every motion deliberate. I had been sitting at the kitchen table for an hour, staring at the empty coffee cup, the notebooks sealed back in their box, the unopened curtains letting only a thin sliver of light through. Something in me had reached a quiet breaking point, the kind that doesn't explode, doesn't scream, just bends until it becomes something else. I put on my coat, buttoned it slowly, and stepped outside. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and laundry soap, the familiar scent of the building, but the world beyond the glass doors felt different, sharper, more watchful. The pavement was slick, reflecting fragments of clouds. I walked without destination, carrying nothing but the letter folded inside my pocket like a second pulse. I ended up at the river. The water was high, restless from the previous night's rain, and the current moved with an urgency I envied. I found a bench under a half-bare maple tree and sat. For a long time, I did nothing but breathe, trying to feel what I actually felt. Grief had changed shape again. It was no longer a knife or a weight. It was a kind of fog, dense enough to quiet everything, but light enough to move through me. The wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of iron and wet leaves. I closed my eyes and heard his voice, not the sick, weakened one from the hospital, but the one from years ago, steady and low, when he used to tell me stories as we fell asleep. In those days, I believed that listening to someone's breathing was proof of love. Now I knew it could also be proof of habit. I don't remember making the decision to go back to the pharmacy, but I found myself there again, standing outside, watching through the glass. The shelves were stocked, the light steady. Darlene was behind the counter, speaking to a young man who looked like a delivery driver. She laughed at something he said, a short, unguarded laugh that startled me with its gentleness. For a second, I saw what George must have seen, the simple warmth of someone who didn't expect anything from him. Not love, not history, not performance, just presence. I stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed faintly, and the air smelled of antiseptic and paper. Darlene looked up, smiled automatically, the way one does for every customer, and said, "Good morning. Need a refill?" Her voice was softer than I remembered, as if she'd spoken through a long night. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I just wanted to ask about a supplement my husband used to buy." The lie came easily, because it was true in its own way. He had come here for something, even if it wasn't medicine. She nodded, walked to one of the aisles, and returned with a small brown bottle. He might have taken this one. It's popular for the heart. I looked at the label, but didn't read it. "He passed away," I said quietly. She froze, eyes flickering with recognition, not of me, but of the name she must have seen written somewhere, maybe on a prescription bag or a note. "Oh," she said after a moment. "I'm sorry. He was very kind." I watched her face as she said it, the slight hesitation, the careful selection of words. Kind, not wonderful, not extraordinary, kind. That small adjective hit me harder than I expected. I thanked her, took the bottle, and left before she could say anything else. Outside, the wind had picked up, pulling at the hem of my coat. I walked until my legs ached, then kept walking. I passed the bakery, the park, the bus stop, the familiar rhythm of my small city unspooling around me as though nothing had changed. But everything had. When I reached home, I sat on the couch without removing my coat. I thought of her face, her eyes when she said he was kind, and realized she hadn't said it like a woman defending a secret. She said it like someone who had been given something fragile and knew better than to break it. It was then, in that quiet recognition, that something inside me began to turn. Not forgiveness, not even understanding, but the beginning of perspective. I had spent months circling the wound, examining it from every angle, but I had never looked beyond it. Now, for the first time, I wondered if what I felt wasn't betrayal, but inheritance. Maybe he had given me, unintentionally, the chance to see him fully, without the armor of habit. That night I opened the notebooks again, but this time I didn't read them like evidence. I read them like letters from a man who had been trying to tell me something while there was still time. The early entries were full of details, his blood pressure readings, lists of chores, appointments, notes about weather, but slowly his tone shifted. He began writing about memory, about the way small things fade without meaning to. "I can't remember the sound of her laughter anymore," he wrote once. "It used to fill the kitchen." I tried to recall the last time he had made me laugh and couldn't. The next page said, "She's still here, but the space between us has grown an echo. I say goodnight, and it takes a few seconds before it reaches her." I closed the book then, pressed it against my chest, and sat in the half-dark. It was too late for conversation, but not too late for honesty, even if it was only with myself. The next morning, I called Anne. She didn't pick up, but later she sent a text. "Busy. We'll call tomorrow." She didn't. I didn't mind. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to chase her affection or fix her silence. I began spending afternoons at the library, a place where quiet didn't feel like punishment. I borrowed books I'd once meant to read, poetry mostly, thin volumes full of small truths. I read them by the window and sometimes caught myself whispering lines under my breath like prayers. On the third visit, I saw a notice pinned to the bulletin board, "Community Writing Workshop, Wednesdays at 2. I almost laughed at the coincidence. A writing group. I imagined George sitting at that same table, his careful script filling a yellow pad, surrounded by people who listened. Maybe he had gone to something like that. Maybe Darlene had encouraged him. I took a flyer anyway and slipped it into my bag. The first session was awkward. A handful of people, mostly retirees, a teacher with two bright eyes who insisted there were no wrong words. I wrote slowly, my hands stiff, unused to long stretches of movement. We were told to write about a moment that had changed us. I began without thinking. He left me a letter that taught me the truth about silence. When I finished, the teacher asked if I wanted to share. I said no, but she read my expression and said softly, "That's all right. Some words need to stay on the page a while before they can breathe." Her kindness undid me in ways I didn't expect. I went home lighter, almost dizzy from the release. The days began to find a rhythm again. Mornings with coffee and the newspaper, afternoons at the library, evenings walking by the river. I passed the pharmacy less often, but whenever I did, I found myself glancing at the window. Once Darlene saw me and waved, just a small motion of her hand, as though we were acquaintances, not the two halves of the same secret. I waved back. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Somewhere between the river and the bridge, I realized that I no longer wanted to know everything about what had passed between them. Knowing was no longer power, it was weight, and I had carried enough of that. That evening, I opened the letter again. The paper had softened at the folds from being handled too often. I read the last paragraph aloud, as though reciting it to someone who might still be listening. "She saw me when you stopped looking." I said the words slowly, and for the first time, I didn't hear accusation. I heard explanation. He hadn't meant it cruelly. He had meant it simply. People look until they can't bear what they see, and then they look away. We had both done it. I folded the letter once more, slid it into its envelope, and placed it beside a small vase of fresh flowers on the table. It no longer felt like a weapon. It was just paper again. That night, I dreamed of him sitting at the kitchen table, writing, the light falling across his hands. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled the way he used to before words failed us. When I woke, the room was full of dawn, and for a moment, I couldn't remember what year it was. The pain was still there, but it had softened around the edges, like sea glass smoothed by time. I knew the healing wouldn't be grand or sudden. It would be ordinary, quiet, almost invisible, but it had begun. For the first time since the funeral, I made breakfast with real hunger. I even put on the radio, though the static was louder than the music. It didn't matter. The world had sound again, and that was enough. The weeks that followed acquired a rhythm that could almost be mistaken for peace if you looked at it from far away. Mornings that began with the kettle and a deliberate making of the bed. Afternoons spent at the library, where the quiet had rules and, therefore, felt honest. Evenings by the river whose steady motion gave my thoughts something to lean against. And in that rhythm, my breath smoothed out, and my hands stopped trembling when I reached for the box of notebooks. Yet the calm was not a destination so much as a landing between flights, because the past, when it wants its due, is punctual, and it arrived first in the clipped voice of the lawyer requesting that I attend a brief meeting to finalize the transfer I had already been told about, and then in the text from Anne. No greeting, just a line about options and contesting and, "Mom, you can't be naive about this." And finally, in the look on Darlene's face when I saw her through the pharmacy window and realized the tiredness under her eyes had deepened into something like worry that did not belong to her alone. I told myself I would go to the lawyer's office and behave like a woman who knew how to sit straight-backed without apologizing for being there. But the room they put me in was too cold and too bright, the kind of brightness that makes every paper look naked, and I could feel the old habit of shrinking try to rise up in me like a reflex, the way I used to fold my opinions into thin squares and slip them into a drawer when George cleared his throat in that careful way that meant he didn't have room for my feelings. And I pressed my palms flat on my skirt and listened as the lawyer, a neat man with a polite beard and the emotional tone of a waiting room, read through the last formalities in sentences that were more architecture than language. And when he paused to ask if I had questions, I heard myself say that I did not because there were none, but because questions would confirm a desire to rearrange what had already happened. And I have learned that rearranging the furniture does not change the house. When I came out onto the sidewalk, Anne was leaning against a parking meter, arms folded, the stance of a woman who assumes the weather is something she can command if she glares at it long enough. And she didn't hug me or even touch my sleeve. She just began in that swift, efficient cadence that makes you feel as if your slowness is an insult, telling me that the transfer to a stranger was unacceptable, that she had spoken to someone about freezing assets, about fiduciary duty, about standing, about what the neighbors would think when they heard Dad had left a car and money to a woman who sells cough syrup and batteries. And I watched her mouth form those words and realized I was far less offended by her contempt for Darlene's job than by the way she had rebranded grief as a task she could excel at if she found enough correct terms. And I told her quietly that the will was the will, and that I would not be joining any attempt to unwrite a dead man's handwriting, and the surprise in her laugh cut more than if she had raised her voice, because it revealed that she still believed she could direct me like a junior employee. And when I did not bend, she went for the old wounds, told me I had never fought hard enough for our family, that Dad had drifted because I let him, that I was doing now what I had always done, which was accept less than I deserved and call it dignity. I walked away while she was still speaking, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because staying would have turned me into the woman I used to be, the one who thought endurance and collapse were the only two doors in the hallway, and I chose the third door, the one where you keep walking, and I found myself, without planning to, in front of the pharmacy again, where the bell over the door chimed, and Darlene looked up with that small, unsurprised smile I had come to think of as her way of refusing to make a ceremony out of pain, and I almost said nothing, almost bought a packet of tissues and left. but the truth is a living thing, and it will starve if it never sees light. So I told her, very simply, that my daughter might look for her, that people in grief do foolish things, that if anything was said in anger, it should be laid at my feet and not at hers. And I watched her shoulders drop a fraction, watched an entire parade of defensiveness she had prepared march back into storage. And she thanked me in a voice so low it made the aisles feel like pews. And then she reached under the counter and produced a small envelope with my name on it, written in the square hand I knew better than my own. And for a second, the room tilted, not because it was unexpected, but because the body prepares for the past, even when the mind does not. She said he had left it with her months ago, with the instruction that she should give it to me, if it ever seemed like I needed a different kind of truth than the one on paper. And I took it without opening it, and felt the strange weight of paper that has waited too long, and I heard Anne's voice out on the sidewalk like a breaking wave, and when I turned, I saw her through the glass, standing very straight, eyes hot with purpose, and she came in fast, her face organized into something she thought would score points, and she started on Darlene in the tone people reserve for service workers when they want to rehearse their cruelty without consequences, asking how long she had been sleeping with my father, asking whether the car was worth the humiliation, and the sound my mouth made was not a word so much as a refusal, a long vowel that said stop without asking. And I stepped between them and said there would be no cross-examination here, that grief is not a sport with a podium, that if Anne wanted to aim her hurt at someone, she could aim it at me because I could bear it, and my daughter's eyes flashed with the brittle pleasure of an old pattern. But Darlene did something then that neither of us had prepared for. She put both hands on the counter as if steadying a ship and said she would take no more questions because there was nothing she could say that would win in a court where love was admitted only as evidence of theft. A young clerk in the back hovered near a phone as if deciding whether to call the police. A woman near the greeting cards watched us with the slow attention of someone who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of a family tearing along an invisible seam. And I told Anne it was time to go, that we could ruin one another in private if we had to. And the look she gave me then carried all the rooms we had never cleaned together. And she left with that hard, quick walk that says, the argument isn't over. It's only changing location. And when the bell chimed again behind her, the air seemed to widen by an inch, enough for breath, and Darlene exhaled like a person who has returned from underwater, and we stood in that small, fluorescent light and let our eyes rest. Outside, the sky had gone a heavy pewter that made the streetlights wake early, and I walked home with the unopened envelope inside my coat like a second heart. But I did not open it right away, because I was learning that not every door should be rushed through, that some truths require a posture you cannot hold if you are still shaking. And instead, I made tea and sat by the radio and watched the shadows climb the wall in long, steady lines. And much later, when the building had quieted and the nurse's shoes made that soft rubber hush in the hallway, I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the page. And the first line was not an apology and not a plea. It was a description of a small afternoon years ago, the time we ate peaches on the back steps and let the juice run down our wrists because it was too sweet to be captured neatly. And he wrote that he had never known how to tell me that those were the moments he lived on when the house went silent, that he stored them like winter fruit against the season when we forgot ourselves, And the letter went on in the voice of a man who had tried to stay precise, because precision was the only dignity left. And he told me he had asked Darlene to give me this, not because she was the keeper of his secrets, but because she had become the witness to the person he had been when I could no longer bear to see it. There was a line near the end that burned more than the rest, not because of accusation, but because of accuracy, where he said that somewhere along the way we had both chosen safety over speech, and that safety is just a quiet word for distance when it's used too often. And I took the page and held it to my chest and realized I was crying, not for the betrayal, but for the economy of it, for the way we had rationed ourselves when abundance might have been possible if we had been braver. And I slept with the letter beside the lamp and woke with the new habit of not hating him for the wrong thing. The next day brought a different kind of weather, the human kind, a knock that carried impatience in its knuckles. And when I opened the door, Anne brushed past me with a cardboard box I recognized from the attic, the archive of our domestic life that had gathered dust precisely because no one wanted to be the curator. And she set it down on the table as if delivering evidence, and told me that if I refused to act rationally, she would protect Dad's legacy without me. And she lifted the lid and began to spread photographs like cards. My 25-year-old face next to his on a pier, Anne at 8 with a missing front tooth, a summer picnic where everyone is half sunburned and laughing. And she jabbed her finger at each image as if photographs could be compelled to testify. And when I said gently that the man in the pictures had also left a letter and a will, and that the dead own their choices more certainly than the living, she closed her eyes as if someone had blown smoke at her, and she said words that were accurate in their injury, that she had learned early how not to need us, that we had given her competence instead of comfort, and then been bewildered when she took what we trained her for and used it to survive. There is a way to lose an argument and still win something worth keeping, and I let her finish and did not defend myself line by line. And when she was empty, I picked up one photograph at random, the one of George in a cheap beach chair with his knees knocking together, and I said I missed him in a new way now, not the way of a widow counting days, but the way of a woman who has finally found the map and can see the roads we refuse to take. And she looked at me for a long time without speaking, and then gathered the photos as if they were spooked birds and slid them back into the box, and she left it on the chair, perhaps forgetting it, perhaps leaving it as a dare, and she kissed my cheek with the short, dry kiss of people who can only afford gestures and small change. And she said she would not apologize to the pharmacist, and I said I wasn't asking her to, and after she left, the apartment felt like a stage after the actors have gone, scuffed and honest. The writing workshop that week asked us to bring an object that contained a story we had not yet told, and I carried the fountain pen he had stopped using the year the arguments became procedural, the one with the tiny nick near the nib from the time. It fell off the table during a summer storm, and I set it on the laminate surface as if it were a small animal I did not want to startle. And when the instructor asked what it was, I said it was a tool for making a kind of weather in the body. And I wrote for 10 minutes without lifting my head, sentences that felt like rowing against a current that had finally turned. And when the time was up, the woman across from me, a retired nurse with the softest hands I've ever seen, said that sometimes the finest care is not in keeping someone alive, but in keeping them company while they remember they already are. And I thought of Darlene and the way she had listened to totals and numbers and the small weather of my husband's aches without asking for a poem, and I realized that gratitude can enter through the same door as humility if you leave it unlocked long enough. It would have been easier if the world had left us to our quiet corrections, but ugliness prefers an audience, and 2 days later, a neighbor stopped me in the lobby with the careful pity of a person who enjoys knowing the thing you don't want known, and she said she had heard that Anne had been asking around about the pharmacist, that there was talk of writing a letter to the paper, that someone had suggested reporting alleged exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and I thanked her for her concern and took the stairs because I needed the muscular honesty of climbing, and at home I called Anne and told her I would not tolerate a crusade built on the broken bones of assumption, that her father had been many things but not incompetent and not coerced, and she said through her teeth that I was protecting the wrong woman, and I said I was protecting the smallest chance we had left of not becoming people we would despise if we met them in the mirror 10 years from now. That night the wind came hard off the water and rattled the window as if it wanted to be let in, and I sat on the floor with the box of photos and the letter and the pen and the last notebook open to the page where his script had begun to tilt, and I understood with a steadiness that did not feel like surrender that the next act would have to belong to me, not as a reaction to what had been done, but as a declaration of what I would refuse to be. And I cleaned the pen and felt the weight of it in my fingers, and I thought of the pharmacy bell and the way it marks each entrance with the same small chime, whether you arrive with cruelty or relief. And I closed the notebook and turned off the lamp and let the dark gather around me like fabric that can be tailored into something that fits. And in the morning, I woke to a message from the lawyer asking if I would be willing to provide a written statement affirming that my husband's dispositions reflected his will and not anyone else's. And I said yes, because sometimes the way forward is not forgiveness, but a straight line drawn with a steady hand. The visit I received later that day was almost comically formal. A man in a suit too new for his shoulders standing at my door, with a folder marked with my name as if I needed reminding. And he said he represented a party with concerns and wanted to ensure my well-being, and I told him I owned my well-being outright and had no intention of listing it. And when he asked whether I had any reason to believe the pharmacist had unduly influenced my husband, I told him I had many reasons to believe she had not. The first being that she understood what to leave untouched, and he left with the unease of someone who has failed to find the switch that turns off a woman's certainty. And after he was gone, I laughed in a way that felt like stretching a muscle you'd forgotten could still move. I do not pretend that the days after that were sweet. They were not. They were full of small ambushes, the way grief will hand you an orange and it will smell like the year you almost left and didn't. The way a bus timetable can remind you you once waited in the rain for a man who didn't know you had already forgiven him for something he hadn't yet done. But even those ambushes began to lose their teeth, and in their place a different kind of pressure rose, not to collapse, not to rage, but to choose. And I sat with the pen and the paper and the envelope and felt the edges of a decision take on the weight of an object, something you can lift and then set down and then lift again. And outside the river kept moving, as if to say that not all currents are meant to be resisted. Some are to be entered with both arms forward and the willingness to be carried precisely where the water has already learned to go. The decision formed in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't announce itself, but gathers slowly, grain by grain, until one morning you realize you are standing inside it, like a room that has been waiting for you to arrive. It was a Thursday, warm for late autumn, the kind of day that pretends to be gentle until you step outside and the air reminds you that softness can still bite. I woke before dawn and sat at the table watching the steam rise from my coffee. The letter lay beside the cup, worn from being folded and unfolded, its creases like the lines in an old hand. For weeks I had been circling it, touching the envelope, reading a sentence, closing it again, as though postponement were a form of care. But the weight of postponement is its own punishment. I looked at the fountain pen on the table, the one I had cleaned, filled with new ink, and I knew exactly what I would write, even if I didn't yet know what it would mean once it was finished. Some acts are like that. They do not reveal their meaning until after the hand has moved. I began with her name. It looked strange on the page, less like an intruder now, and more like a coordinate, a fixed point in the map of what had happened. Dear Darlene, I wrote, the words steady, my hand unexpectedly calm. The next line took longer. I had started this letter a dozen times in my mind, once in anger, once in apology, once in confusion. But none of those tones belonged to the woman I had become since that first morning when I opened George's letter. What came instead was something quieter. I told her I had read his journals, that I had seen the parts of him he had chosen to share with her, and that while the discovery had undone me, it had also freed me from the illusion that I had ever been the only mirror in which he saw himself. I told her that for years I had been proud of how still I could be, how calm, how loyal, as though constancy were the same as love, and that perhaps in that stillness I had become invisible, even to myself. You saw him when I had forgotten how, I wrote, and then stopped because the honesty of the sentence frightened me. I took a breath, read it again, and decided to leave it untouched. The truth, once written, has its own right to remain. I wrote for hours, the pen moving with the slow certainty of someone weaving a net from her own unraveling. I told her about Anne and the confrontation in the pharmacy, about the things that had been said and the things that had stayed unsaid, about the cruelty that hides in the language of protection. I told her that I did not believe in ownership anymore, that love is not a plot of land to be fenced and inherited, that George's letter had been less a betrayal than a confession of need, and that, in a strange, backward way, I was grateful that he had found a listener before he died. He was lonely, I wrote, and I was proud. You didn't steal him from me. You simply answered when I could not hear him anymore. When the words finally stopped, when the ink ran thin and the light shifted from morning to late afternoon, I signed my name. There was no flourish, no closing sentiment, just my name, plain, final. I folded the pages, placed them in an envelope, and sealed it. Then I took the pen, wiped the ink from its nib, and laid it inside a small box, along with the original letter he had written to me. The box was one he had made years ago from dark cherry wood, its corners mended where a hinge had once broken. It had always sat on his desk, holding stray coins and stamps. I emptied it, placed both letters inside, and closed the lid. For a moment I just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the faraway sound of traffic, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I thought about the years we had spent together, how every argument, every silence, every kindness had built this moment like sediment building a shore. There is a clarity that comes not from forgiveness, but from exhaustion, when you have carried something long enough that setting it down feels like remembering how to walk upright. I left the apartment with the box in my bag and walked to the river. The air had turned cold by then, a brittle wind moving off the water. The trees along the bank were mostly bare, their branches black and clean against the pale sky. I found the bench where I had sat that first day after reading his letter. The wood was damp, and the smell of the river was heavy with mud and leaves. I placed the box on my lap and ran my fingers over the lid. The temptation to open it again was strong, to reread his words one more time, to delay the act that would make the past truly past. But delay is just another form of fear. I stood, walked to the edge of the embankment, and looked at the current. It moved steadily, not fast, but with purpose, as if it had always known where it was going. I opened the box, took out his letter first, then mine, and for a moment I held them together, paper against paper, like the palms of two people who can never touch again. Then I let them go. The pages caught the wind, lifted briefly, then sank, curling as the water soaked them. They drifted a few feet before dissolving into the gray surface. I stood watching until there was nothing left to see, only the ripples spreading outward, erasing their own origin. The act was neither dramatic nor peaceful. It was something harder to name, a reclamation perhaps, not of him, but of myself. The river did not offer comfort, but it did offer movement, and that was enough. When I turned to leave, the sun was setting behind the bridge, turning the sky the color of copper. The cold bit at my cheeks, but I felt lighter, emptied in a way that wasn't loss. That night I slept deeply for the first time in months. My dreams were unremarkable. No letters, no voices, just the soft blur of ordinary things. A garden hose running, the sound of a kettle, a child's laughter from a neighboring yard. When I woke, the world seemed quieter, as if something that had been holding its breath had finally exhaled. I made coffee, buttered toast, and opened the curtains wide. Outside, a thin mist hung over the river, glowing faintly in the early light. I thought about George, not the man from the notebooks or the man from the funeral, but the man who had built this table, who had once spent an entire weekend fixing a crooked shelf just because I'd said I wanted the books to look even. I realized that loving him had been a series of such small acts, and that those acts, even unfinished, were enough. Later that day, I went to the pharmacy one last time. I didn't plan what I would say. I just knew I needed to see her, to hand her something that wasn't an accusation or a question. She was behind the counter, as always, her hair pulled back, her glasses slipping down her nose. When she saw me, she looked surprised, but not uneasy. I walked up, placed a small wrapped parcel on the counter, and said, "This belonged to him. I think he would have wanted you to have it." Inside was the fountain pen. She looked at it, then at me, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came. For a long moment, we just stood there, two women linked by the same absence, and then she nodded, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she said. Her voice trembled on the second word. I smiled, not out of grace, but out of recognition. "He wrote beautifully," I said, and she nodded again. "Yes," she whispered, "he did." I turned to go, but she called after me. "He always said you had the kind of strength that scared him," she said softly, "not because it was harsh, but because it was quiet. He didn't know how to stand next to it." I didn't answer. I just placed my hand on the door and stepped out into the cold. The bell above the door chimed once, clear and brief, and then the sound was gone. Walking home, I felt an unfamiliar stillness inside me, not numbness, not relief, but something like balance. The truth had rearranged itself into something livable. I thought of Anne, of the box of photographs still sitting in the corner of my apartment, and knew I would call her soon. Not to argue, not to explain, but simply to ask if she wanted to see the river with me one day. Maybe bring her son, show him where the water bends under the bridge. Some legacies are not written in wills or letters. They are carried in gestures that refuse to end. When I reached my door, I paused before turning the key. The apartment was the same as always, but it felt newly honest. I hung my coat, sat at the table, and looked at the empty space where the box had been. It was just a patch of wood now, bare and unmarked, but I could still feel the ghost of its weight. I rested my hands on the surface and whispered, "All right then." It was the same phrase I'd spoken the morning I first opened his letter, but this time it meant something different. It meant I was no longer waiting for answers, no longer holding my breath for apologies that would never come. The story had closed, but I had not. The quiet around me wasn't emptiness. It was space, and it was mine. The days after that were almost weightless, as though the air itself had loosened around me, and I found myself moving through each hour without the usual drag of memory pulling at my ankles. Nothing about my life changed in any visible way. The same apartment, the same window with its view of the river, the same kettle whistling in the morning, but the silence had lost its sharpness. It was no longer the kind that waited to be filled. It had become a companion, a neutral witness. I woke earlier than usual and let the first light spill into the room before I rose, watching how it slid across the table where the box had once sat. The wood still carried a faint mark, a pale rectangle where dust had not yet settled, a quiet outline of everything that had been contained there and released. I thought about George often, but not with the feverish ache that had once kept me awake at night. He came now like a guest who knew when to leave, a brief visitation in the smell of coffee, the sound of shoes in the hallway, the sight of an old man walking hand in hand with his wife along the riverbank. His absence had changed shape. It was no longer a wound to be dressed, but a space in which something else could begin to breathe. Anne called the following week. Her voice was careful, almost polite, the tone of someone testing an unfamiliar bridge. She didn't mention the argument, didn't mention the will or the pharmacist, just asked if I wanted to have lunch on Sunday. There was a hesitation in her invitation that told me she half expected me to refuse, but I said yes. On Sunday, she arrived with her son, a boy of 12 who had George's eyes, the same quiet blue that always looked as though it were keeping a secret. We ate by the window, soup and bread, simple food that asked nothing from us. She talked about her work, her husband, the noise of the city, and I listened without correcting or advising. When she mentioned that her son had started writing stories, something inside me tightened. Not pain, not nostalgia, but a small flicker of pride I hadn't allowed myself in years. After they left, she kissed my cheek and whispered, "You look well, Mom." And though I knew it was partly kindness, I also knew it was true in its own way. That evening, I took a walk along the river. The sky had turned the color of wet stone, and a thin mist hovered just above the surface of the water. I found the same bench as before, the one where I had sat through so many versions of myself, and I stayed until the lamps along the path began to glow. Somewhere behind me, a couple was arguing softly, their voices threading through the air like distant music. I watched the current shift around a fallen branch, the water bending, but never breaking its rhythm, and I thought of how life, too, bends and carries what it can. I imagined the pages of those two letters long since dissolved, their ink scattered, absorbed into something larger than either of us. The idea comforted me that our words, even the painful ones, had returned to the same element that had once carried our laughter, our small domestic sounds, our shared silence. When I returned home, the phone was blinking with a message from Darlene. Her voice was low, hesitant, the sound of someone reaching out across a delicate distance. She said she had received the pen and that she had written me a note, but hadn't decided whether to send it. Then, after a pause, she said something that stayed with me. He used to talk about how you folded laundry like it was prayer. I thought you should know that. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was such a small memory, something so domestic and unremarkable, yet it struck with a force that undid me. All those years, all the distance, and still he had been watching the way I smoothed fabric, the way I tried to keep order in the face of what I couldn't control. I replayed the message once, then deleted it. There was nothing left to answer. It was enough to know that kindness had found its way back, however late. The next morning, I opened the window wide. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp leaves and faraway smoke. I made a pot of tea instead of coffee, a small change that felt like a new ritual. And as I poured the first cup, I realized I was smiling. It wasn't joy exactly, but something steadier, a kind of acceptance that had taken root quietly while I wasn't looking. I went to the closet and took out the coat I hadn't worn in years. The one George had once said made me look too serious for spring. It still fit, though it hung a little looser now. I put it on and left the apartment, locking the door behind me with a calm that felt like closure. At the park, children were playing near the water, their shouts scattering the stillness. I sat on a bench and watched them for a long time, the rhythm of their movement both foreign and familiar. A woman near me was knitting, the sound of her needles soft and patient, and I thought how many lives continue side by side, never intersecting, each carrying its own quiet grief and its own fragile peace. The thought didn't sadden me, it grounded me. The world had gone on long before I learned to understand it, and it would go on after. My role now was simple, to bear witness without bitterness, to see clearly without demanding more. As the light began to fade, I took from my bag a small notebook, not one of his, but mine, new and clean. On the first page, I wrote, "When he left, he didn't take my story with him." Then I closed it and placed it beside me, feeling the weight of those words settle into the body like a gentle stone. The river kept moving, the air cooling around me, the city dimming one lamp at a time. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for anything, not for an apology, not for a sign, not for the past to shift into something more forgiving. I was simply there, breathing, the sound of the water folding itself into the dark, the small, steady pulse of my own heart marking time. Before I left, I whispered something into the wind, not to George, not to Darlene, but to the version of myself that had once thought love was only what stayed still. "You were wrong," I told her. "It moves, it always moves." And then I stood, brushed the leaves from my coat, and began the walk home, the path ahead glowing faintly under the last light of day.